All right, Ali, very excited to have you here today, joining me on this Illumination Summit. Following our theme, let's attempt to bring cybersecurity back to Earth. Ali, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
All right, let's get right into it. We had 7 questions for you today so that we can illuminate our participants into some of the most important topics in cybersecurity. Number 1, how do you advise organizations to separate the useful from the noise? Cybersecurity is a noisy market, right? So what is your advice when making purchasing decisions on technologies in cybersecurity?
Yeah, so this is a great question because you're absolutely right. There is a lot of noise. I've definitely seen this at Forrester for being here for over a year and a half. I've gotten to know a lot of the vendors quite well, and I've seen a lot of the noise. So to kind of break this down, I want to let you in a little on how I actually define markets, because I think that this really helps the conversation, helps structure the conversation around what's important to practitioners. So I tend to break down market segments into a couple of different requirements, 3 actually. The first is capability, the second is dependencies, and the third is time to value. If a new technology is able to meet all 3 of these requirements in a differentiated way, if there's enough traction in the industry, and of course, if there's enough client interest, that's when I actually start to define a new market segment. And this is really important because these 3 things are really critical for practitioners to understand as they're choosing whether or not to adopt a new technology, but we often don't hear a lot about 2 of them. We often most hear about the capability side, what the technology actually does. This is what we hear about in marketing messages and high-level conversations, or when people are talking to sales. And it ultimately covers what the technology does, how it addresses some of the challenges that a practitioner has better than what they already have, and also potentially what the technology replaces. But these other 2 are actually incredibly important for CISOs. The first being dependencies. So this is the much less fun side of tech. This is the actual management and operation, the maintenance behind the scenes for the tool. What dependencies exist? What does maintenance look like for the tool? What will employees need to do? And how many employees will you need to use the technology? How is it licensed? All the nitty-gritty that is incredibly important as CISOs are thinking about what they need to buy, but often doesn't come up until much later in the buying cycle. And then lastly is time to value. So when am I actually going to be able to use this thing? What is the time to value? How do I deploy it? What risks exist during the migration? These 3 requirements give a much more complete view of a new technology prior to adoption by a CISO. And it's really important to understand these 3 to get a better picture and to try to kind of ask these questions to cut through some of that noise. And then the last thing that I'd recommend is wholeheartedly, the most important part of this process is the POC, actually getting your hands on the product and seeing what it does. This is really critical because it lets you see what your team is going to be capable of doing with it, whether or not your team's comfortable with it, how they feel about it. And ultimately, it gives you a much better understanding of a new product than just reading their website or reading the data sheet. So those are the definite requirements that I think about and that I recommend to practitioners.
So capability, dependency, time to value, and the POC. Do not forget about that. We're all in on that as well, Ali. So, number 2, we get asked a lot about what can be done in the middle of a cybersecurity crisis, right? Which is not much because you're already in the middle of the mess. What is the advice that would you give companies to get ahead of a crisis?
Yeah, so I think about this in 2 parts, and I know that this really does often come up that preparation is key, but truly it is. Build incident response plans and test them across the organization. This is a lot like what Jeff was saying just now about his experience in aviation. Checklists matter. Checklists are important. It's also really helpful to build in redundancies. Again, as Jeff was saying, you don't want one little mistake to affect an entire event, which is why those redundancies are so important. We also have data that proves this at Forrester. Organizations that struggle with incident and crisis response preparation spend a median of $3 million per breach, as opposed to those that do not have those same challenges, those who are prepared, who spend 2.4 million. So it's quite a big difference to having an incident response plan in place and tested, and also tested across the entire organization, not just the security team, but also marketing, sales, customer success, operations. Everyone involved, everyone needs to be involved, since ultimately they will be in the event of a breach. Now, when it comes to actually being in the middle of a breach, the best recommendation that I have is stay calm, identify the people who are able to stay calm in the middle of a crisis and use them as much as possible. And ultimately, transparency is key. A lot of the organizations that have handled breaches the best have been transparent about them to their customers and to the public. And they've been able to communicate what's happening and why, and not try to hide it or try to persuade their customers or employees to keep it secret. Ultimately, breaches happen, and the best way to respond to them is by taking responsibility and by leading through the example that you set to other organizations.
Very insightful. I often tell the best way to prepare to a crisis is to avoid the crisis, but you're right. Let's go into detection of incidents, right? Of detection of threats. What do you think is the biggest detection gap in most cybersecurity programs today?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So consistently, this is again some Forrester data, consistently over the past 5 years, one of the top 3 challenges for security teams is the changing and evolving nature of IT threats. This really has an effect on me when I see it, because you would think that after 5 years, this would change, but it hasn't. It is still one of the top 3 issues, along with day-to-day tactical activities taking up too much time and the complexity of the IT environment. So ultimately, from a detection perspective, the biggest gap is being able to keep up with new threats. That is a huge challenge for practitioners. But I do want to go one level deeper, because ultimately it's about a lot more than this. One of the reasons that Zero Trust has caught hold the way that it has is because a huge part of doing detection well is also having those basics right and being able to have an infrastructure that you can actually have visibility into, that you can actually manage, that you have protection and controls in place to help prevent a lot of these detections from having to happen. So when I think about the biggest gaps for detection, it's actually not having the controls and protections in place that we need to prevent the need for more detection taking place, and to try and constrain detection to what's really, really dangerous and what's really, really sophisticated. So I think about it through the lens, not just of, hey, we're struggling to detect these latest threats, but also, hey, we need to improve our protection and control strategy to make sure that we don't actually have to detect as many things as we're seeing. I think that oftentimes, much like we were talking about earlier, detection is the flashy, interesting part of cybersecurity, which is part of why I cover it and why I really enjoy it. But we need to remember all of the other aspects that play a role in that, and protection in particular is so important here.
So interesting to get your point of view on that. I'm sure the audience must be thrilled with that as well. Talking about detection, let's go into an area that I know you're covering closely, which is XDR, right? This new trendy topic. And the cybersecurity industry has evolved into EDR, XDR, NDR. How do you see the evolution of this market? What the buyer needs to keep in mind when they are bombarded with these different messages?
Yeah, so this is actually a really great question, and I'm very, very glad you asked it, because I have spent over a year and a half, actually, since I joined Forrester, researching XDR. It was the first thing that I was tasked with doing once I joined Forrester. So I actually wrote the first defining piece on what XDR is for Forrester. I also did a new tech on the space, which is really a market overview of all the vendors at play today, and a new wave, which evaluated many of the top vendors in the space today. So I've gotten a pretty good overview of what XDR is and been able to even talk to some clients and customers who are both considering XDR and have actually started using it. So it's given me a really good understanding of where the market is today. And ultimately, the XDR market is a battle between precedent and innovation. So what do I mean by that? In order to understand what I mean by that, we have to start with SIM. The SIM is precedent. It's what we're used to. Take in as much data as possible to give hopefully a lot of visibility, give flexibility in things like queries and analytics, and the ability to bring in whatever data you want. And you can see this has manifested and maintained over time. The SIM has been the center of the SOC for probably since the SOC has been around. I mean, it's been over 20 years that we've seen the SIM in use. And the way that we at Forrester think about the SIM is as security analytics platforms, which is really the next evolution of SIM. When you think about how SIMs have begun to consolidate or have ultimately consolidated capabilities with user behavior analytics and then also SOAR capabilities. This combination of SIM, SOAR, and UBA is a security analytics platform. It's looking to go beyond what was originally a very compliance-oriented offering into a real detection and response lifecycle tool, really owning up to the center of the SOC. And so this has been really useful because of the customizability that you're able to get from the SIM, that you're able to get from SOAR. You can ultimately have your team create whatever playbooks you want, create whatever rules you want, create whatever integrations you want. But there's a challenge with this. And that is namely that our talent pool doesn't have the security skill set or the time to do this work. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but some of the top challenges for security leaders are day-to-day tactical activities taking up too much time and also not having the skill set that they need in-house. And so this has added some complexity where security teams are struggling a bit. If you think about a typical detection engineering function, it requires not only a detection engineer, but also a threat intel manager and a threat hunter to be able to find more threats. And that combination, that is expensive, that is hard to find, that is hard to retain. So we actually saw a different approach coming to market over the past 10 years, which has been EDR. And EDR philosophy is really that the endpoint is where the highest efficacy telemetry is. It's where the business data is kept. And it's one of the most important places to be able to detect from and to gather information from. And that's been very successful. We've seen that through the EDR market and also through the success of the MDR market. There's a lot of valuable telemetry that you can get from the endpoint. But a couple of problems here too. The first being that there's a lot more data that's important than just the endpoint, than just what's available on the endpoint. You know, when I talk to practitioners, if I tell them that I'm thinking about taking away their network analysis and visibility tools, they say, you can take it out of my cold dead hands. Like they have zero interest in losing that visibility because it is so important to them. It's where they have a lot of sources of detection. It's a very important tool. And so ultimately what incident responders have to do is they have to take their EDR alerts and bring them into the SIM anyway, because they need to correlate and enrich them with other sources like network, like identity, like now cloud. So that's one problem. The second challenge with this is that the business data is no longer on the endpoint. It's now in the cloud. And so ultimately, EDR vendors have faced a bit of an existential crisis because their importance is no longer as high as it once was. So these two factors have motivated EDR vendors to actually try to shift to a different strategy, which is XDR. It's about bringing more telemetry into the tool than has been brought in previously to provide more context, more visibility, and to hopefully maintain the importance of the EDR vendor ultimately. So this combination is very important because a lot of practitioners want that mix of data coming from not only their endpoints, but also from things like network, from things like identity, from things like cloud. So this mix is really critical. And ultimately, what we've seen is that practitioners get a lot of value out of this because in a lot of cases, the vendor is able to do some of the detection engineering on the back end for them. And so it's able to reduce some of the load that we classically see on security teams and help them be more productive and more effective at stopping some of these threats.
Cool. It's very interesting because in the conversations that I have with a lot of prospects, they often tell me, Ricardo, if I will start my SOC again, I would probably start in a very different way than it is today. And you're very right that the centerpiece of the SOC is the SIEM. Now, going back to the SOCs, how do you see the SOCs evolving? What is going to happen in that transformation? How the security operations centers use data, operate data, and ultimately create value to the organization?
This is a great question. I love this question because I'm actually doing quite a bit of research on it as well. It's very important to me, since I do cover security operations, to cover these kinds of critical questions, like what does the current state of the SOC look like? And also, what does the future look like? So the future of the SOC, through this research, I found is ultimately as a service to the rest of the organization. It is about providing a service to the rest of the business that's effective and that's high quality, and that ultimately can lead the way to better alignment with the business. And so I think about this coming in 5 different parts. First, the most important thing that you can do today is to start identifying ways to measure success and measure waste within your SOC as it is right now. This is really important because actually finding ways to measure this information is very hard. First off, it's very hard to measure success in the SOC, but it's really critical to understanding where you're not performing well or where you could be performing better. And it's important to think about it in the context of the entire organization, not just what's happening in the security team itself. The second is we need to start using automation in a more targeted and effective way. The way that I've seen SOAR work in a lot of production environments is very challenging. You get 2 to 3 playbooks, and that's about where you max out in terms of what you can actually automate on as grand a scale as a full-fledged playbook. So it's important for us to identify ways that we can use automation more conveniently and more organically in existing processes to take some of that load away. The third is building out individual skill sets through ultimately mentoring of newer analysts. For the SOC of the futures to succeed, we need every single person in the SOC to be a mentor and to be providing the knowledge that they have, spreading the knowledge that they have to newer analysts, so that we can look to hire people who perhaps we had overlooked previously because of their lack of experience. Fourth is to augment your staff with an existing security service, whether that's MDR or whatever the security service of the future looks like. Oftentimes vendors are the ones that are able to entice top talent. And so augmentation ultimately becomes a necessity, because what we see is that a lot of these vendors, they're able to pay more, they're able to give better benefits, they're able to give a better career path than you would necessarily see in an internal SOC. So being able to augment your staff with some of these individuals is really crucial. And lastly, and most importantly, is to serve the organization and to think about how you're serving the organization through the lens of employee experience and customer experience. Because regardless of the SOC being an internal function, it has an impact on the employees in the organization and also the perception from customers. So these are the 5 elements that I think are most critical when thinking about how to make the future of the SOC into a better and more effective and higher quality service to the rest of the organization that's also able to get what they need from the rest of the business.
It's interesting to see that the industry is evolving in a way that makes cybersecurity operation relevant than ever. And we truly believe that cybersecurity is a field that has to be operated. And it sounds like it's now also in the mindset of the whole industry and, of course, the cybersecurity practitioners. Ali, we're getting to the end of this interview. and I want to ask you two additional questions. Let's start with going back to the crisis, right? What type of people should we be in the lookout to prevent or to avoid a crisis? How companies can find their Jeff or their Sully that will make sure that the worst case scenario doesn't materialize when it comes to cybersecurity incidents?
Yeah. Look for people that have a track record of keeping their cool under pressure. And this will not always be people who are already in cybersecurity, former firefighters, EMTs, air traffic controllers, military personnel. You don't necessarily need to look for a veteran incident response professional to have someone who is really effective at managing a crisis. And further, if you're looking for a veteran incident response professional, they're going to be very difficult to find and also very difficult to retain. So make use out of people who have some of these adjacent functions and are able to really take point and lead on something like responding to a crisis because of their previous experience in other roles. I talked to Jake Williams about this a few years ago. And one of the things that he said as well is like how important it is to have that kind of experience prior to really understand what it's like to be in a true crisis and to know what you need to do, what next steps you need to take. So look for people who can have control and maintain control of a room, even when things are going all wrong.
Interesting to see how the skill set that's required to do the job evolves as technology evolves and facilitates new ways to do things. Thank you, Ali. Last question, and I promise you this is the last one. I kind of have someone from the industry in an interview and not asked about ransomware. So what is one of the things that cybersecurity professionals should know about ransomware and how to avoid it?
Yeah, so when it comes to ransomware, it's obviously a very hot topic. I see a lot of conversations that fluctuate between ransomware is totally special compared to other types of malware, and you need to treat it that way. And ransomware is like any other malware. They really move between those two. As with most things, the answer is ultimately going to be somewhere in between. Ransomware is different than other types of malware, but many of the steps to protect against it are similar. The biggest thing that organizations can do when they're thinking about their ransomware defense is prioritization. Prioritization is really key. In conversations with clients, a lot of times they'll come to me and they'll say, listen, I just want you to list out everything I can be doing to defend against ransomware, and I'll stop you when I have a question. And it made me realize that ultimately, there's a lot of confusion on what to prioritize and how to prioritize it and what that looks like, because there are just so many entry points that you could be affected by. So I like to think of managing your ransomware defense strategy around what you can do in the short, medium, and long term for success, and basing that around a couple of different dimensions for prioritization. Things like cost, time to actually implement it, whether or not you need to buy a new tool, or you can implement it natively within your environment based on the controls that you already have. Think about what you can do quickly that has a big impact that potentially doesn't cost very much, what you need to spend more time on, say a year to 2 years implementing, or what's a part of your long-term strategy. And really what I like to say is that when you get to the point of the long-term strategy, look at how that aligns to your zero trust strategy as well, because ultimately there's a ton of crossover and you don't want to be duplicating initiatives or having them be disjointed. And so a lot of ransomware defense in the long term is about the way that it fits into your zero trust strategy and is about having a zero trust strategy.
Allie Mellen from Forrester, thank you very much for sharing your experience and your insights with our audience today.
Thank you so much for having me.